todo mundo também super convidado. Os detalhes disso tudo estão nos sites, há um cartaz ali na frente que vocês podem, onde o site está especificado, tá bom? Umas pequenas palavras sobre ele, para quem não conhece, acho que é o caso de quase ninguém aqui. O professor se preocupou extensamente em termos de estética e filosofia da arte, com ênfase não tão recente na filosofia da literatura do cinema, forte inspiração no Stanley Cavell, no Wittgenstein, no idealismo alemão e no romantismo. Dois dos seus livros mais recentes, entre muitos, são Werner Herzog, Filmmaker and Philosopher, e Images of History, Kant, Benjamin, and Human Subjects. Ele vai ministrar a palestra em inglês, mas a gente se traduziu e estamos projetando na parede, tá? Detalhe, a palestra que ele vai ler não é exatamente aquela, porque ele fez algumas modificações, então não estranhe se houver pequenas discrepâncias, mas são poucas, tá? Perguntas no final, podem ser feitas em português e em inglês, e a gente logo vai traduzir para outra língua. Tá? Vocês podem fazer por escrito também, se quiserem, entregue para o lado por escrito. Tá? O que mais? Bom, só agradecer o apoio do professor Lapa Quadrado e da professora Gabriela Vasconcelos Andrade, que está ali, sem os quais esses eventos não teriam sido possíveis certamente. Bom, é isso. Richard, welcome once again. The floor is yours.
3 seconds. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the museum for the room. And thank you to Raphael for his introduction and his translation of this text. This is a paper about why poetry is important, why it's important for a healthy life, and maybe even for democracy. I hope you will want to talk about it.
Ele diz que esse é um paper sobre a importância da poesia, e não só a importância da poesia para a vida, mas a importância da poesia para a democracia. Então vamos ver como é que essas coisas se podem.
So, poetics, perspective, truth, the aesthetic authority of lyric. Plato notoriously banished the poets from his ideal city because their poetic productions occurred as a result of inspiration, not knowledge, and because they engendered unruly emotions in their audiences, rather than knowledge and self-control. Whatever one makes of the justice of this banishment, to many, at first, the description of how poets work and of the effects of their products will seem right. Truth claims seem not to be in view, and any cultural authority poets might happen to have can easily seem unjustified. Francis Bacon regarded poetry as feigned history, made-up history, that submits the shows of things to the desires of the mind, hence a matter of merely pleasing appearances rather than of truth. Alexander Baumgarten held that a successful poem is a piece of perfect sensate discourse. In contrast with perfect intellectual discourse that classifies things in the world correctly, that perfect sensate discourse holds our attention on its surface arrangement and centrally affords experiences of pleasure, not knowledge. In a more Aristotelian spirit, we may find these views one-sided and overstated, and we may wish to defend the cognitive and practical importance of poetry. I do, I will today. But it is not easy to see exactly how to do this. Truth with respect to merely fictional worlds seems less than the real thing. The shaping of emotions, as in Aristotle or Walton, seems sideways to the serious business of seeking knowledge in the sciences, and it seems pale in comparison to actual experience as a matter of the formation of character. Monroe Beardsley describes the experience of art as allowing the least emptiness, monstrosity, frustration, lack of fulfillment, and despair, the qualities that cripple much of human life. But he does not go on to say how this experience is anything other than an escapist compensation for the pains of life. Adorno describes art as the plenipotentiary of a better praxis than that which has to be predominated. And it may well be that human practical life is the domain to which poetic truth is relevant. Yet Adorno does not make immediately evident how art successfully embodies and transmits a truthful message about how things ought to be, or how it might otherwise help to refigure practice. How then, if at all, can art, and in particular lyric poetry, be authoritative or cognitively significant in relation to some significant domain of human practical life? A number of important philosophers have offered significant responses to this question, including, besides Aristotle and Walton, Kant, Dewey, Goodman, and preeminently Hegel, Holland, Marcuse, and Adorno, in whose work politics is more foregrounded. Most of their answers, however, suffer from being too abstract, in too interrelated senses. They do not say enough about how art, and in particular lyric poetry, engages with concrete matters of social practice, so that they are not political enough. And they do not say enough about the technical devices of lyric poetry that enable and embody this engagement. To take up the first, more socio-political deficit, in order to generate a plausible account of how art and poetry matter for us, it is necessary to develop a broad account of fundamental human interests and powers. One way to do this is to pay some attention to the currently dominant form of social life, global industrial capitalism, and to how, whatever its manifold virtues in encouraging productivity and making some degree of comfort available for many, that form of life also blocks human well-being in certain specific ways. To the extent that we find significant deficits in human well-being within this form of life, fundamental human interests will then become evident as unrealized within it. So here comes the bad news about contemporary life. Two features of this form of life seem especially prominent: the dominance of instrumental reason as expressed in the massive development of technologies that subserve human material consumption, and the de-skilling of labor, particularly in the shunting of non-technically trained members of the labor force into low-skill service jobs such as office cleaning, lawn care, fast food operations, and so forth. As a result of these features, the pressure to enter into and to remain within the scientific or financial elite has become overwhelmingly intense. Those succeeding in the competition acquire some possibilities of pride and pleasure in intellectually satisfying work, but they are also increasingly required to undergo long periods of one-sidedly technical training that leaves little room for cultivation of powers of meaning-making and responsiveness to others. If you're going to get ahead in the competition that will have many losers, you had better prioritize every possible advantage in technique, law degrees as well as MBAs, a major in computer science as well as economics, biochemistry as well as physics, and so on. For the mass of people who do not succeed in this competition, what remains is either low-paid, deadeningly repetitive work in the low-level service industries, or somewhat higher-paid work in white-collar service industries, such as teaching, real estate, or human resources, where there are some possibilities of comfort, but frequently little social respect. This social institutional background expresses the predominance of instrumental reason over meaning-making and free reasoning about ends. Against this background, things that might otherwise be meaningful, for example, sexual intimacy and family life, can themselves come to seem to be either escapist havens in a heartless world, or, worse yet, just new arenas for the instrumental achievement of merely personal satisfaction, as the participants in these arenas come to ask themselves, what's in it for me? Similar attitudes affect and inform such substantial stretches of the practices of religion, politics, and art. Religion can degenerate into church shopping in pursuit of props to self-esteem. Politics can become a polarized, factional struggle over rights, powers, and goods that is largely devoid of genuine argument, solidarity, and generally sustainable appeals to justice. I fear that's where we are. Art can become what Friedrich Schiller memorably described as the kind of indulgence that works like a sedative for the stupid savant and the exhausted businessman, that rocks the mind to sleep, gently mesmerizing it. Moral conversation threatens to collapse into expressions of preference and emotion, while emotivism becomes a prominent meta-ethical theory, and the theory of practical reasoning is significantly ceded to economics. Different people doing different things and competing for resources to do so undermines and displaces the cultivation of joint social life in shared meaningful practice, supported by good reasons. All this is not always and everywhere bad. There are not only enhanced possibilities of comfort for many within modern socioeconomic life, there are also greatly widened chances for the cultivation of individuality and for freedom from coercive authority. Everywhere, however, there is also a lack of the experience of self-unity as assurance in continuing worthwhile practical activity that is recognized as such by others. Depression, anomie, and despair are pervasive diseases of modernity. Everywhere, in Ralph Waldo Emerson's memorable phrase, our moods do not believe in each other. Drift threatens to replace confident onwards. We arrive at a similar result by considering directly the nature and plights of selfhood. Like the concepts professor, licensed real estate broker, and union member, self is a status concept, though it is less specifically institutionally governed than these three. Unlike the concepts lion, electron, and oxygen, self is not the name of any kind of material entity that subsists apart from human practices. Selfhood exists only insofar as it is achieved. Acquiring selfhood, the status of being a self that material human beings acquire, is a matter variously and in various degrees of becoming responsive to reasons, of forming and entertaining multiple potential action plans in the form of desires, as opposed to unarticulated bodily needs and wants, and of controlling one's impulses, rank ordering one's desires, and choosing which of them to act on in various circumstances. Human beings normally enter into this status or acquire the core abilities that are characteristic of selfhood during early childhood through imitative behavior, the development of increasing bodily control, and initially imitative language learning, all under the guidance and control of parents and other caregivers. Along with imitation, considerable amounts of coercion and regulation are involved. Bodily responsiveness is shaped and constrained as very young children learn when and when not to sleep, eat, cry, and relieve themselves, as well as what to call various things. The demands that are made on them during this stage of development are multiple, and frequent enough resistance to them in the form of crying and refusal is a natural part of the process, as all parents know. Representing objects under concepts, deliberative reflection, and conscious choices among alternatives co-emerge in early childhood as the actualization of the interrelated faculties of a rational animal. Among the natural liabilities of this development, as Freud clearly saw, are anxiety about compliance with multiple demands and the repression of libidinal instincts. These two are not altogether bad things. Anxiety is the obverse side of the complexity and plasticity of cultural life, and repression to some degree is the inevitable price of civilization. But the development of selfhood as a reason-responsive, desire-articulated agency remains nonetheless a complex and fraught affair. As John Gibson aptly observes, we are multitudinous in the sense that selves contain contradictions, layers of complexity, and forms of disorganization that show that persons and the lives they lead are themselves often ambiguous, paradoxical, provisional, and at times perhaps even nonsensical. Selves and their experiences are an inescapably messy affair. Under the conditions of modern life, then, this inescapably messy affair of selfhood is likely to involve considerable loss of libidinal investments in activity, which will often enough be a matter of drudgery, in relationships where compromises in roles under social norms can restrict creative meaning-making, and even in perception where dull recognition of the typical displaces responsibly fresh sensation. We live often enough in what Marx described as the absence of the expression of our species being in cooperative, creative, reasonably and effectively meaningful activities and relationships, but where proletarian revolution seems not to be an available solution. Most people, that is, live much of the time without what Wordsworth called, and here's the long passage from Wordsworth: it would be wonderful if life were like this, but I am saying it isn't. Most people live much of the time without what Wordsworth called the highest bliss that flesh can know, the consciousness of whom they are, habitually infused through every image and through every thought, and all affections by communion raised from earth to heaven, from human to divine. Hence, endless occupation for the soul, whether discursive or intuitive. Hence, cheerfulness for acts of daily life, emotions which best foresight need not fear, most worthy then of trust when most intense. Hence, amid ills that vex and wrongs that crush our hearts, if here the words of holy wit may with fit reverence be applied, that peace which passeth understanding, that repose in moral judgments which from this pure source must come, or will but by man be sought in vain. Who, as Wordsworth immediately goes on to ask, is he that hath his whole life long preserved, enlarged this freedom in himself? Certainly not Wordsworth himself, despite his sometime claims to the contrary. His poetry remains marked by recurrent anxieties of reception and worries about whether he is able to sustain fit converse with others. Not many of us, and perhaps not any of us, at least much of the time. Yet, given the nature of selfhood, the conditions of its formation, and the sometimes availability of satisfying courses of activity and relationship, the perfection of selfhood toward this kind of continuing, coherent, consciously reflective satisfaction in activity is also an ambition that it seems impossible to forego. Now comes the good news. Where then might we find practices that enable and center around the cultivation and achievement of selfhood as assured agency in meaningful activity? No doubt there are many such practices, including at least friendship, family life, long-term sexual intimacy, workplace identities that embody both for selfhood, hence the always simultaneous granting of otherness as well, I do not understand the value of art. The suggestion here is that sometime in roughly the early modern period, the practice of waiting for the advent of the city of God at the Last Judgment waned as early modern commercial and manufacturing life opened up new social roles and possibilities of practical identity. Many people, and perhaps preeminently newly emergent petty bourgeois craftsmen and merchants, with their suddenly open yet uncertain prospects, and artists with even more open and uncertain prospects, as court life began to founder, began to worry about how to express their rational powers and practices in a successful and satisfying way, in the hope of overcoming a sense of powers, agency, and selfhood, somehow blocked or wasted. Art, and in particular lyric poetry, that both traps and enacts, performs, an arrival at fullness of expressive power and accomplished agency, a poem on the growth of a poet's mind, say, might do better. Lyric poetry's enactments and accomplishments might then further prove proleptic for its audiences. It is the office of poetry, as Wordsworth puts it, to describe objects and utter sentiments of such a nature and in such connection with each other that the understanding of the reader must necessarily be in some degree enlightened, and his affection strengthened and purified. Victor Shklovsky echoes this thought in his essay Art as Technique. Habitualization devours work, clothes, furniture, one's life, and the fear of war. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived, and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. More recently, the German philosopher Georg Bertram has argued that art makes a contribution to becoming a subject, insofar as human beings are the kinds of beings who take a stance toward themselves and attempt to determine themselves as they reflect on possibilities of the effective and satisfying use of their distinctively human powers. Building on both Kant and Cavell, Thomas Hilgers argues that an artwork asks a person to engage with it in such a way that her sensuous, affective, and conceptual capacities enter a play-like state of interaction. This state affects a person in three related ways. It makes her temporarily lose her sense of herself. It makes her gain a sense of the other. And ultimately, it makes her achieve selfhood. These claims will naturally provoke suspicion from a taxonomic sensibility. Surely, not everything that is reasonably called art contributes to the achievement of selfhood. As Hegel rightly remarks, it is of course the case that art can be used as fleeting play, affording recreation and entertainment, decorating our surroundings, and giving pleasantness to the externals of our lives, as well as in many other ways. But here, the claim that Cavell, Shklovsky, Bertram, and Hilgers are all making is not taxonomic, but rather a matter of calling attention to the powers of art that give it an important place among the practices of human life, and that justify its serious and sustaining practice and study. Among the arts, lyric poetry, neighbored by its cousin, song, is arguably the most immediately and directly first-personal form of art. As Hegel notes, it is also, with some variation, the most universal of arts. Poetry, Hegel says, enjoys its periods of brilliance and success in all nations, and at practically every period which is productive of art at all. For it embraces the entire spirit of mankind, and mankind is particularized in many ways. More recently, Stephanie Burt has argued, citing among other things the monarch of the 13th century Chinese poet and theorist, Yan Yu, that we can find very good evidence of something a lot like lyric, and a lot like the prevalent modern idea of lyric. Introspective, expressive, with much attention to sound, existing, if not in all times and all places, than centuries before the new critics were born. So now we'll turn to how lyric does this job. Despite this recognizable persistence of lyric across historical variation, there is no simple definition of lyric available that will separate lyric neatly from such neighbors as song, ballad, pastoral, aphorism, epitaph, epithet, anecdote, elegy, ode, and so on, by specifying formal features that are necessary and sufficient conditions of lyric. There will always be borderline cases, and in different contexts of reception, it will be appropriate to stress one or another formal feature as therein marking off lyric. This is part of Schlossky's point that art must always dehabituate perception and heighten attentiveness by using shifting devices that are less typical or foregrounded in either daily message content or prior instances of art. We can, nonetheless, note some central features of lyric provisionally in order to focus subsequently on lyric's powers in relation to the cultivation of selfhood. Much, but not all, lyric poetry is a relatively short, highly organized presentation of a sequence of thoughts and feelings on the part of the speaker, prompted by an emotionally perplexing object, scene, or incident. According to M.H. Abrams, a lyric is any fairly short, non-narrative poem, presenting a single speaker who expresses a state of mind or a process of thought and feeling. The term non-narrative here is somewhat misleading, in fact wrong, since we find a speaker thinking and feeling one thing after another in a temporal order that is organized in such a way that one thing leads to the next. What is rather meant is that lyric is typically in the present tense and in the first person, not describing the doings of a lot of people out there. In describing what he calls this strange time of the lyric now, Jonathan Culler notes that in the Norton Anthology of Poetry, only 123 of 1,266 rhymes are in the past tense, and 21 of these are ballads, which should be the Norton Anthology of Lyric Poetry. This indicates the stress in the lyric on the present expression and working through of emotions, bound up with thought and perception, over the narration of events in the past. Through diction, assonance, rhyme, enjambment, and especially rhythm, the formal organization works to hold attention on both the poem itself and the presence of the speaker as rhetor, as well as on what the poem recounts. Robert von Halberg describes these formal features that focus attention on the poetic object and the speaker as musicality. Musicality does not properly ornament poetry, nor emphasize its paraphrasable sense. It rather names the origin of art, an order of experience and value, unconstrained by particular concepts or reference, and knowable in the flesh. There is frequently an out-in-out structure, as a lyric is initiated by a present perception of an emotionally perplexing object, scene, or incident, that in turn calls forth reflection, memory, generalization, association, and assessment, until the poem closes with a return to present address to an imagined reader. Summarizing work by Ava Nula-Zetkin, Kohler notes several tendencies that distinguish lyric from other genres. 1. Brevity. 2. A reduction of the fictional element. 3. More intense formal structuring. 4. Greater aesthetic self-reference. 5. Greater linguistic deviance. And 6. Greater epistemological subjectivity. Overall, we can say that a poet in composing a lyric will typically organize and be attentive to, and will invite readers to be attentive to, 1. An initiating incident, perception or thought, motivating a sequence of further perceptions, memories, thoughts, and feelings, organized in a plot. 2. A general theme that makes the sequence somehow broadly relevant to human life. 3. The organization of the poetic surface to sustain a pattern or musical flow. 4. The development or modulation of emotions in relation to all of plot, theme, and poetic surface. All of these aiming at 5. Dramatic closure in the calming or completion of thought and feeling, in a return out of perplexity and into more direct outward address, away from internal reflection. What is, at least centrally and typically, the point or function of this lyrical poetic organization? Helen Vendler describes it as the achievement of living thought, opposed to cliché, in which readers are invited to share. Living thought, she writes, must, like ordinary thought, characterize, allegorize, reason, denominate, and analogize. But it must also jump up and down, over and under, left and right. It must swell and contract, leap from register to register, joke and feel pangs. Above all, it must advance too swiftly for instant intelligibility. The reader must hang on for the ride, bounding to the next hurdle, hardly having recovered his seat from the last. It is as if the poet wants to say, this is what thinking really is like. Have you ever known it? The closure or achievement of overall sense that is aimed at is more dramatic and more meant for participatory rehearsal than for propositional assent. This overall dramatic organization that invites and sustains imaginative participation helps us to understand what Clement Brooks has in mind when he argues that the structure meant in a lyric poem is a structure of meanings, evaluations, and interpretations. And the principle of unity which informs it seems to be one of balancing and harmonizing connotations, attitudes, and meanings. But even here one needs to make important qualifications. The principle is not one which involves the arrangement of the various elements into homogeneous units, pairing like with like. It unites the like with the unlike. It does not unite them, however, by the simple process of allowing one connotation to cancel out with another, nor does it reduce the contradictory attitudes to harmony by a process of subtraction. The unity is not a unity of the sort to be achieved by the reduction and simplification appropriate to an algebraic formula. It is a positive unity, not a negative. It represents not a residue, but an achieved harmony. Elsewhere, Brooks argues that contradiction is inherent to poetry. That is to say, the unity achieved is a dramatic unity that finds closure in the lightening or easing of an initiating perplexity, thus embodying the achievement of a more stable, confident selfhood, more capable of address, resulting from a kind of owning or endorsement of the course of present experience just rehearsed. An important strain in 20th century lyric theory, motivated by suspicion of romantic effusiveness as mere gushing, and by the pursuit of impersonality in modernist objectivism, took the drama of the achievement of unity in poetic closure to be a matter of the poet's invention of a fictional persona that experiences this drama. This tendency treats the lyric poem as a dramatic monologue that offers insight into the character of that persona, almost as if every lyric were fundamentally like Browning's My Last Duchess. As William Wimsatt and Cleon Brooks put it, once we have dissociated the speaker of the lyric, the persona, from the personality of the poet, the actual poet, even the tiniest lyric reveals itself as drama. Against this tendency, Jonathan Kohler argues that it treats a lyric more or less like a novel in taking it to be a text with fictional characters. Kohler stresses instead the musicality, the ritual character, the present tenseness, and especially the epidemic character of much lyric. That is, its display of rhetorical skill in the enactment of ceremonies of praise and blame, such as panegyric, encomium, and funeral orations. The fundamental character of lyric, Kohler argues, is not the description and interpretation of a past event, but the iterable and iterative performance of an event in the lyric present, in the special now of lyric articulation, where lyric articulation is a matter of epidemiensis, public discourse about meaning and value, made distinctive by its ritualistic and usable elements. It is normally odious, according to Kohler, to posit a fictional speaker, and normally mistaken to take lyrics to be in the past tense. Yet Kohler also concedes one of the central points of the new critical style of reading, that the words of the lyric poet are there for us to try on for ourselves. We are to imagine ourselves speaking them, and in doing so participating in the dramatic development that they enact. As Kohler puts it, often in reciting the poem, deploying the words the poet has generously offered for our use, we are trying on a thought as much as expressing it, projecting and perhaps above all intensifying anew. This rightly calls our attention away from biographic details of the poet's life that are exterior to this work. What matters are the words of the particular poem, the work that they do, and how we take up that work by imaginatively participating in it. We can, in fact, make sense of how both of these things could be true, lyric as musical epidemiensis, and lyric as the offer of a dramatically structured role available for a reader's imaginative participation, if we bring into view richer and more accurate conceptions of selfhood and emotion. Understanding lyric as both epidemiensis and available dramatic role will in turn help us to understand the cultural function of lyric and its achievements of authority through its use of formal structures in relation to its subject matter. Selfhood is, as already noted, a status concept. It makes no sense to think of the self as any kind of entity. The locution, myself, was originally a dramatic intensifier, as in, I myself think, and references to the self as an entity are generally paraphrasable away without loss. If the self were some kind of non-physical entity, we would face insuperable interaction problems in trying to understand how thoughts and feelings inside a non-spatial self could cause events in the material world, and vice versa. Thinking of the self as an entity results in infinite regresses of self-knowledge, as self-B must be posited to know the states of self-A, self-C to know the states of self-B, and so on. A purely internal, non-spatial self would be cast into permanent alienation, as it would lack any way to establish contact with an external world by certifying its inner states as correct representatives of outer reality. But exactly what kind of status is selfhood? It involves the acquisition of a degree of agency, as opposed to mere caused responsiveness to one's environment, insofar as one becomes responsible to reasons, capable of entertaining multiple action plans, and able to control one's impulses. These are all matters of degree, and the work of achieving and inhabiting selfhood is never fully done. One's achievements and exercises of selfhood as assurance and reason-supported agency, both in belief formation and in action, remains always in and resources of attractions, and it requires there are always formal situations. Attempts to achieve and exercise selfhood as assurance in agency will be specifically under threat in a world that doesn't make sense, where many of the things that must be done, filling out these assessment forms, inserting lock assemblies into door frames at a rate of 20 per hour, or studying poetry in school, make no obvious immediate sense to many of the people who have to do that. Our social world is full of such things, and frustration and a sense of rational agency blocked or coerced are all too likely to result. Frustration will in turn be felt in the form of a variety of emotions, perhaps acknowledged consciously, but also perhaps repressed. Here it is important to remember that an emotion is not a simple moment of isolated feeling. Not only do emotions have intentional objects and cognitive contents, in addition to felt qualitative intensities and bodily dispositions to action. Emotions also, as Peter Goldman rightly notes, comprise a pattern of these developments that develops over time. As Goldman puts it, the pattern has certain features. It includes characteristic thoughts, judgments, feelings, memories, imaginings, actions, expressive actions, habitual actions, and much else besides, unfolding over time, but none of which is essential at any particular time. It involves emotional dispositions as well as particular experiences, and there will be characteristic interactions between these. Not only do we live in and experience such patterns, we also potentially and sometimes actually have a share in modifying them, insofar as we can, and sometimes do, reflect on the elements of the pattern and its development over time. Reflection opens up a perspective on the elements of the pattern, enabling us to assess whether they are coherent, well-founded, and apt. In Goldman's terms, we think of ourselves as agents persisting over time. You, the thinker, the external narrator, can think of yourself in past episodes, doing and saying things, and you now do this in a way that enables you to conceive of the episode as having an emotional import that you did not recognize at the time, and thus you are now able to have an emotional response that you didn't have at the time. Lyric, in particular, involves an agent situated in the present and under the influence of prompting by an initially emotionally perplexing object, scene, or incident, undertaking a course of reflection on the elements of a pattern of emotion in the hope of clarifying the emotion, owning it, as it were, by arriving at the sense that its elements, some of them now reformed, some newly added, are at last coherent, well-founded, and apt. Achieving this arrival is a movement from the initiating perplexity, from a sense of the pattern of emotion merely suffered, into comparative stability and clarity of emotion, the pattern actively maintained. It is this movement into clarity and aptness that Hegel is describing when he writes that the task of lyric is to liberate the spirit not from, but in feeling. When this liberation in feeling happens through the lyric poet's present reflective modulation of the elements of a pattern of emotion, Then, as Hegel puts it, the poet makes of an already felt passion an object purified from all accidental moods, an object in which the inner life, liberated and its self-consciousness satisfied, reverts freely into itself and is at home with itself. In doing so, the poet identifies himself with this particularization of himself, so that in it he feels and envisions himself. In this way alone does he then become a self-bounded, subjective entirety. That's a wonderful phrase to get to thinking about, self-bounded, subjective entirety. To become in this way a self-bounded, subjective entirety is to cease being an other-bounded, subjective partiality or fragment, merely receiving its experiences and hemmed in by life. I have been charmed to learn that there is an expression in Salvador that one sees on t-shirts that says, "Don't squeeze my mind." In Spinoza's terms, the poet moves from a passive idea of an affection, merely suffering an emotional complex without achieved and assured agency within it, to an active idea of an affection, wherein the emotional complex is adjusted and maintained, and responsibility is taken for it. Coulomb remarks that the subjectivity at work in lyric is a formal principle of unity more than the consciousness of a given individual. In one way, this is right. As Hegel says, we have no inclination at all to get to know the poet's particular fancies, his amours, his domestic affairs. We want to have in front of us something universally human so that we can feel in poetic sympathy with it. But it is not only a formal principle, as though our interest in the poem were only in it as a well-formed, pleasing whole, and the object of our sympathy and our identification is not something abstract and universal, but rather this poetic individual's exemplary working through and becoming clear about the occasioning and modification of a pattern of thought and emotion. If it is both possible and valuable for this to happen, and if its happening solves a widely shared problem for human subjects that is all at once practical, affective, and cognitive, then it makes sense to think of the lyric poet as manifesting for our imaginative participation genuine possibilities of more meaningful life in and with particular experiences. As this work is carried out by the poet in the present tense, often including at present recalling something that is relevant to the emotional pattern, the object of attention and emotion is itself complex. It includes not only the initiating, emotionally perplexing object, scene, or incident, but also associated thoughts about that initiating perplexity, or senses of things that are like it, which in turn call forth new thoughts and emotions. In addition, the poet in the present of writing is aware of the particular words that are beginning to compose the poem, of their rhythm and flow, and of the associations that they call up. The poet's effort is to make all this, the recording of perception and of associated thoughts, and the expression and development of emotion in relation to objects of attention, including words, cohere into an achieved fullness of attention. One standard sign of this achievement is the coincidence of plot closure with thematic closure, emotional closure, and formal closure, as the ending of a narrative arc of reflection coincides with the full illustration of a thought, with perplexity yielded to clarity, and with rhythmic cadencing. In its pursuit and achievement of formally structured fullness of emotionally suffused attention, the lyric poem embodies what von Halberg calls a range of language beyond the orders of most institutionalized communication. The aim of lyric is not simply the transmission of belief about how things factually are. When words cohere musically, von Halberg adds, They allude to a significance beyond paraphrase. Orphic values help one distinguish especially ambitious work from academic or industrial product, and music is the chief criterion. These Orphic values consist in the lyrics' enactment and expression of an entry into fuller, more active, more aptly felt, lived attention on the part of the poet's successful experiment in selfhood. This enactment and expression are made available to the reader for imaginative participation and rehearsal. The lyric thus functions as a rebuke to and overcoming of cliché, inattentiveness, and deadness of perception, not abstractly and from outside experience, but instead in relation to the experience of a specific object of attention. It can help us, as Cavell once put it, to save love for the world until it is responsive again, by finding it, the world, for a moment, good enough for living as an arena for the exercise of our powers. We can be lifted out of instrumentalism, routine, and inattentiveness, and into the discernment of significance via the experience of emotion directed toward an object, and thus into the further achievement of selfhood, as reason-responsive desire articulated, assured agency in meaningful activity. Not every successful lyric for every reader on every occasion of reading, of course. The imaginative responsiveness of readers will also be informed by the extent to which the initially emotionally perplexing object is also an object of their experience, by their habits of responsiveness to formal organization, and by their native idiolect, among many other things. But for many exemplary lyrics, for many reasons, on many occasions of reading. This result of an imaginative entry to fuller attentiveness and fuller selfhood, initially by poets, and secondarily by readers who find themselves in the poem's words, is a temporally circumscribed sense of orientation in cognitive perceptual activity, achieved through the exercise of powers of meaning-making and reflective attention. This achievement is not, or not primarily, that of arriving at propositional truth about individual objects on the basis of justifications and good reasons, as understood in other domains of cognition. But it is, nonetheless, an achievement of the truth of selfhood, a temporally circumscribed, initially incident-related, felt experience of what selfhood is and is for. Now comes the politics at the very end. This entry into fuller selfhood is not, as has sometimes been charged, elitist, under-theorized, and ahistorical, politically repressive and ethically suspect, in mystifying the expression of personal feeling, in complicity with the privatist ideology of modern capitalism. I think that's wrong. For one thing, lyric appears everywhere, in all historical time periods, economic circumstances, and ethnic formations. For another, the circuits of shared responsiveness to exemplary lyric, while not universal, are unpredictably large. You never know who will be moved. Lyric does, however, propose its own politics. One measure of a just society will be the extent to which it makes participation in such temporally circumscribed achievements of selfhood and fullness of attention available to its members. This will be a kind of liberalism, since not everyone will resonate with every lyrical pattern and enabling of attention. This will, however, not be a liberalism of instrumentalism, exploitation, and faction, but instead a perfectionist liberalism in which the pursuit of selfhood, mutual respect, and a measure of solidarity, all cultivated by lyric, have some role in shaping economic and political life. If we somehow stop our opening ourselves to the powers of lyric, along with the other arts, and deny or ignore its aesthetic authority, always preoccupied instead with what we take to be the more urgent business of productive and consumptive life, then God help us. I'm happy to talk.
Abertas as perguntas, podem ser feitas em inglês ou em português, o Laura traduz para outra língua.
A gente só pede para que vocês usem o microfone porque a gente está gravando e vai gravar o áudio no mic, no microfone.
Vou quebrar o gelo então. Eu sei in English, not exactly a question, but could you elaborate a little bit more on one of the many important ideas of this essay, which is, I guess, expressed exemplary in a quote by Hegel. I don't remember the quotes entirely, but there is the idea of individuality becoming the very individuality becoming the cause of our isolation. Can you develop a little bit more on this idea? Because I think it's central to your.
Posso traduzir?
Eu disse que uma das ideias centrais, dentro de muitas ideias importantes desse ensaio, é expressa de maneira bastante feliz numa citação que ele fez do Hegel, que eu não me recordo perfeitamente, mas que inclui a ideia de que a individualidade, ou a conquista da individualidade, que é uma expressão do Cavel, se torna, de maneira bastante contra-intuitiva, a causa de um sentimento moderno de isolamento. Eu pedi que ele desenvolvesse um pouquinho mais essa ideia.
I think the passage you're thinking of is the one in which I said, or Hegel writes, that in writing the poem, the poet identifies himself with this particularization of himself. His sequence of thoughts, feelings, emotions is owned by him as his or hers, rather than experienced as just stuff that happens. Hegel goes on. In this way alone does he become a self-bounded, subjective entirety. I said that was worth thinking. One way to think about it is to consider the opposite of being a self-bounded, subjective entirety. That would be being an other-bounded, subjective partiality, or maybe even objective partiality. That is, other-bounded, told by other people what to do all the time, how to feel and how to be. A partiality, as though the different parts of your life don't cohere. First you're told to do now this and now that. In other words, you're kind of a mess. And Hegel is saying that it's through the generation by the poet of lyric poetry and our participation in its development that we can be somewhat less of a mess. We can be in our experience over a period of time.
I think I'll just sit beside you so that it helps a little. It was self-bounded, subjective entirety, right?
Yes.
Desculpa, ele fala dessa ideia do Hegel, né, com a ideia de que o poeta se identificaria com a individualização de si próprio, né? Então, que essa ideia que essa citação, né, que ele vai falar que seria uma espécie de um movimento, né, subjetivo, né, eu não sei se há uma tradução para esse termo, o self-bounded subjective entirety. Há uma tradução? Assim, não por pecado, não. Então, a gente fazendo... I'm just asking if there's a specific translation before you that term, but okay. Yeah, we can do it freestyle. A gente pode traduzir então como seria uma completude, né, subjetiva de um sujeito que está direcionado a si, né, ao self, né, com a ideia de selfhood, né, com a ideia da individualidade, né, que estava na pergunta do Rafael. E aí então, se a gente vai colocar, né, essa completude do subjetiva de movimento ao self, o oposto disso seria essa espécie de parcialidade subjetiva, né? Então seria quase como uma espécie de não, a gente deveria fazer isso ou deveria fazer aquilo, uma espécie de, assim, uma ideia de ordem, né? E aí ele falou assim, então you're kind of a mess, né? Então quer dizer que ao se reconhecer isso, o que a gente ouve é, então tu seria uma bagunça, né? É meio que uma bagunça, tudo meio bagunçado, né? Então quando ele vai colocar, ele está dizendo então, se a gente pensar nesse movimento, né, em direção a essa individualização, né, pensando em Hegel e Cavell, quer dizer que a nossa participação pode então, de alguma forma, contribuir para que a gente seja menos dessa mess, né, menos dessa bagunça.
Eu acho que a gente ganha um pouquinho de tempo fazendo o pergunta. A minha pergunta é se a sua exposição ela se restringe totalmente ao desenvolvimento no Ocidente. Algum tempo atrás eu estava trabalhando com a história da tradução dos haikus no Ocidente. Até que ponto um gênero como o haiku se encaixa, seria lírica no sentido que você desenvolveu? Ou passou a ser lírica ao chegar no Ocidente, já era lírica no Japão? Pelo que eu li, não. O que aconteceu com o haiku? Virou lírica, já era lírica, sempre foi?
I need a reference in my footnotes. I can always do Control F. No, it's in a footnote.
Okay.
So. There it is. So a very simple answer, no. It is not strictly to the West. I cited Stephanie Burke, current poetry teacher at Harvard, who's dug up the work of Yu Yan, a 13th century Chinese poet, who writes lyric poetry and talks about it in the way we talk about it now. Hegel, in his Aesthetics, notes cases of lyric in Greece and Persia, for example. He's very fond of Pindar, a very important lyric poet, and Sappho. The figures I mentioned, Jonathan Culler and Robert von Halper, both of them survey varieties of lyric from the Western tradition at least, with enormous detail. And finally, the reference I wanted, there's a paper by Gahan Ramazani, a Persian, Iranian, Canadian theorist I think now, called Lyric Poetry, Intergeneric, Transnational, Translingual. Ramazani has been defended by pointing to cases, the presence and authority of lyric in non-Western cultures in particular. I'm not scholarly enough to have done that on my own, but these people have. What I add is the philosophical vocabulary for thinking about the work of lyric.
Do we have that footnote in that file?
Yes, it's
Okay, so I appreciate it.
footnote 22.
Gente, só pegar que tem uma nota de rodapé que daí vocês conseguem ver exatamente a referência que ele está usando. Fica fácil para a gente acompanhar também. Primeiramente, então, só ainda no caminho da resposta que ele coloca, né? A resposta ele diz, uma resposta simples que é não, né? primeiramente, a primeira resposta que ele fala. No caso que não, a lírica não seria específica ao Ocidente, né? Foi o que foi colocado na pergunta, né? Então ele trata dos exemplos que ele trouxe no próprio texto da palestra, né? Quando ele traz aquele poeta chinês, agora eu me perdi do nome, mas está no texto também, né? E ele vai falar então de vários outros pesquisadores. Ele fala que ele não se considera um pesquisador de, vamos dizer assim, de lírica não ocidental, mas que há outros pesquisadores que ele cita, inclusive citados na própria palestra, que vão reconhecer práticas muito semelhantes ou práticas da lírica ocidental em outras culturas não ocidentais, né? E aí ele vai falar aqui do iraniano, né? Ramazani, né? Então, que ele está falando ali, daí ele usa aquela citaçãozinha ali mesmo, né? De que, falando de um contexto não ocidental, né? Então, usar as frases, caracterizar as posturas de leitura pós-estruturalista de novo historicismo, atribuindo essas posturas especificamente ao Calderon e Virginia Jackson. Ramazani argumenta contra isso, que a lírica não está morta e não é apenas uma forma de elite. Então ele não deu tudo, mas ele colocou que seria, no caso, uma tradição não ocidental que também estaria lidando com a lírica, né? Faltou alguma coisa? Rafael? Só passar por trás aqui por causa da câmera.
So, yeah, first of all, thanks a lot. I was so delighted to hear this talk. That was so meaningful to me. First of all, I would like to thank you. I was so delighted to hear your talk. That was meaningful to me. And I would like you to comment on this a way philosophy would drive us far from the challenge of achieving self-good. On the other hand, Cavell always he says that there is a kind of style of philosophy which has no connection with individuality and no connection with the literature as well. Now, this aesthetic dimension of existence that should be considered in order for philosophy to help us in a sense. So, if you could comment on this contrast between those modes of understanding philosophy.
Português agora.
Primeiro agradeci a fala e depois perguntei. Tem dois modos de entender filosofia. O Cavell sempre diz que é um tipo de filosofia que toma questões de uma maneira um tanto intelectualizada e nos afasta desse modo de conectar a reflexão filosófica com questões urgentes da existência que são colocadas pela poesia e pela literatura. Eu queria que ele comentasse sobre isso.
So yes, the kind of Hegelian philosophy you're pointing to is certainly something I take myself to be doing. It's in resistance to the image of philosophy as theory, which is surely the dominant professional image nowadays, where the result of philosophy is sometimes often modeled on the research report of the sciences. In my own view, that's largely a hopeless effort, though maybe it's relevant for some parts of philosophy. More important is to give a positive characterization of the kind of philosophy Cavell does and that I do. I have seized on the image of the halted traveler that I found in Jeffrey Hartman's reading of Wordsworth. Wordsworth, according to Hartman, is stopped by some event or experience and compelled to think and write, often because the experience is disturbing or horrible. Think of the drowned man in the Prelude, or the prisoner hanging in the gibbet, or the sheer entrancement of going through the fog to reach the top of Mount Snowdon at night. Each of these experiences in different ways pushes Wordsworth to try to come to terms with what perplexes him, entrances him, or overwhelms him, to figure out whether that experience is just an experience of madness that he was thus moved or not. I think of philosophy in general, or the kind I do, is like this, so I applied the image of the halted traveler to Wittgenstein and to Cadell, and other things I've written. And I think it's what I'm doing. Philosophy's first virtue that I once heard is responsiveness to something not there. It's not. Its first virtue is not cleverness or abstractness. It's fullness of response and attentiveness to things. So that's a Cadellian picture of philosophy that is at least the way I do it. And I think it's important that we done, partly to challenge the kind of professionalization that's capitulating to the needs of an industrial and commercial culture, I dare say. It makes philosophy a lot more like poetry.
Gente, depois eu vou trocar de lugar porque tá meio ruim de ouvir. It's a little bad to hear you from this. I'm changing it. Ele só, desculpa, a gente tem algumas coisas que eu não consegui ouvir porque o som para mim tá ruim. Ele vai para lá, daí eu vou trocar de lugar. Mas só para pegar então seguindo a pergunta que foi colocada, né, o que ele está propondo aqui seria uma filosofia caveliana, que ele fala, né? Então ele está aplicando, né, realmente a leitura de Cavell porque ele está colocando na palestra, né? E aí então essa resistência melhorou, obrigado. Ficou melhor mesmo. Só não sei se pro resto do pessoal fica bom. Vocês ouvem igual? Tá. Então a resistência da ideia de filosofia como teoria, né? Então colocar, né, a filosofia como modelos para pesquisa, e aí ele usa bastante o exemplo de Wordsworth, né, de como ele é movido a escrever. O Wordsworth ele se sente compelido a escrever por eventos ou séries de eventos ou ações que ele faz ou coisas que ele encontra, e que cada uma dessas experiências o move a escrever, e que ela se torna também uma experiência de leitura, né? Não só a experiência de leitura para o poeta, essa é a experiência de leitura também para quem tem acesso à experiência que é trazida pela própria lírica do poeta, no caso Wordsworth. Ele fala então, aí só a palavra que ele usou, did you say responsiveness? Yeah, ok. Então tem uma tradução para responsiveness, alguma tradução oficial? Capacidade de resposta, né? Foi assim que a gente traduziu. Então a capacidade de resposta seria a primeira virtude da filosofia, né? Ainda seguindo essa linha caveliana que ele coloca, né? Então a capacidade de resposta às coisas, né? E aí por fim ele fala assim também, é uma espécie de desafio dessa profissionalização das necessidades da cultura altamente industrializada, né? Foi algo que ele colocou muito no começo da fala.
Fazer em português, então, traduz para mim, Raquel, por favor. Na verdade, eu gostaria de ouvir mais dele sobre o final da exposição, porque acho que todo o texto leva para essa ideia da lírica fundando a sua própria política. E eu gostaria de... A lírica fundando a sua própria política. E eu gostaria de ouvir mais sobre isso.
Perhaps founding its own politics is maybe a little too strong, but the kind of politics I favor thinks of the human person as an incipient meaning, someone trying to make meaning, to do things that are worthwhile and valuable in relation to other people. So there's an aspiration to do that. Human beings are centers of possibility and powers of address to their situation. The politics I favor would encourage them and make it possible for them to cultivate and express their powers not simply to do things they have to do in order to stay alive at all. Much of our lives are dominated by that. And not simply to do anything at any instant that they like, but to do the work of cultivating themselves in relation with others, figuring out how to make sense to themselves and each other. I would like a politics devoted to institutions that encourage that.
Much better. Ele falou que talvez fundar os próprios, a lírica como fundando a própria política talvez seja muito forte, mas que ele vê sim que no caso encarar as pessoas, né, os seres humanos, com essa ideia de um significado incipiente, né? No caso então as pessoas teriam aspiração a fazer coisas com significado, né? E a partir dessas ações que a gente pode fazer em relação a outra pessoa e também ter esse espaço na lírica, né? No caso então a lírica ela estaria encorajando, né, e cultivando os poderes dessas pessoas para que elas não façam coisas simplesmente para que se permaneça vivo, né? Então a ideia de além da própria sobrevivência, da ideia de sobrevivência mesmo e além disso, né, uma espécie de cultivação de si próprios, né, de encarar as pessoas que cultivem a si próprios e as próprias aspirações que podem ser manifestadas através da lírica, né.
Good afternoon.
Cultivation of expressive individuality, though lots of things said.
A primeira, ele fala assim, em uma palavra sim, ele começou assim. Aí depois ele disse, mas vamos agora para a resposta um pouquinho mais complicada, né? Então que todas as artes podem fazer isso, né? O que a lírica faz, o que ele defende na fala. Aí ele começa a citar, né, a filosofia, né, as conversas com outras pessoas. Ele diz que até os esportes podem nos trazer isso, nessa relação. E essa relação com essa ideia da conquista, a gente está traduzindo como conquista do eu, né, conquista da individualidade, né, da individualidade do self, né. E aí então ele fala assim que os leitores, né, nós enquanto leitores de poesia lírica, nós imaginamos também aquela voz como uma voz que fala e uma voz que fala para nós, né? Então a gente também, né, se ocupa, a gente também acaba assim pegando aquela voz para nós também como leitores, né? E isso contribui para um tipo de significado que pode ser atingido na nossa experiência de leitor, né? Então, no caso, tanto poetas como leitores eles estariam próximos nessa conquista da individualidade, né, do self-hood, que na verdade vem da experiência de leitura, que leva além daquele, no caso de um enredo, de uma imagem particular que foi colocada em uma determinada obra, mas sim de como a gente traz isso para nós, né, na nossa própria experiência de leitor, na ideia de self-hood, né, na ideia de individualidade que ele está defendendo aqui.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I would like to ask you, what exactly is the place or the role of lyric or arts in general in the world today, where maybe the publicity, with social media, people are more interested in creating profiles than cultivating their self. Eu perguntei qual seria exatamente o lugar da lírica no nosso mundo, na sociedade. Me parece que as pessoas estão procurando mais criar perfis, né, do que exatamente cultivar a individualidade.
Maybe I can draw a distinction between the cultivation of selfhood, good, and the curation of selfhood, bad, Facebook, TikTok, social media. The difference is the cultivation of selfhood takes some work on modifying your own emotions, beliefs, perceptions, and so on, rather than just marketing them or putting them out there. And it involves doing so under conditions that are difficult. There is a wonderful short poem by Wordsworth that begins, "The world is too much with us. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers." So acquiring things, spending things, buying things, producing things. The Marxist thought too. We are not actualizing our genuinely human powers of meaning-making and reciprocal attention. As I understand Facebook and TikTok, it's just getting likes or marketing oneself. So it's not confronting this problem of cultivation, it's curation. If I'm right about that, then maybe I don't know enough about these things.
You say curated?
Curated.
Yeah, like in a nurture.
Yes.
You're curated. Yeah, I get it.
But curating you.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah.
Where the work is already done.
Yeah. No, I was just checking if that was the word he used. Ele usou a palavra cultivação e a palavra curadoria. Eu só estava confirmando se era curadoria mesmo. Então, o que ele fala que seria, teríamos então uma distinção entre o cultivo, né? Cultivação não existe em português, né? Cultivo. O cultivo e a curadoria de self-love, né? Estamos traduzindo como individualidade, né? Então, que o cultivo, né, seria bom e a curadoria de si próprio, né? A curadoria do self-love seria, ele não veria com bons olhos, né? Por que ele defende isso, né? Que seria no cultivo, quando nós cultivamos a nossa individualidade, a gente está empenhado num trabalho de mudança, né? Um trabalho de mudança que envolve como a gente pode se adaptar, como a gente pode pensar em mudar, como a gente pode se relacionar com as pessoas de maneiras diferentes, né? E que seria o contrário da ideia de curadoria, de que na verdade a gente está pegando coisas que já existem de certa forma e está usando isso para um marketing pessoal ou para uma autopromoção de uma maneira que ele veria que está sendo utilizada nas redes sociais, né, na ideia dos perfis, né. Ele também cita um poema de Wordsworth, né, que é "The world is too much with us", né, o mundo está demais com a gente, né, que seria no caso de que há muita coisa, né, então como nós vamos reagir, como nós podemos ter o cultivo dessa individualidade frente à quantidade de estímulos que estão aí, né. E que esse cultivo também da individualidade tem a ver com a atenção recíproca, né? Então não é que é a individualidade do eu, mas a individualidade da reciprocidade, né? E aí, por fim, ele termina, né? Que as redes, então, seriam o marketing e não o cultivo, né? A ideia da curadoria.
One more little thought. I should add, cultivation is hard work, but it can also be fun. Hard work and fun are not necessarily opposites.
Que o cultivo pode dar trabalho, mas que é divertido, né? Que o trabalho duro, o trabalho pesado e a diversão não necessariamente são opostos. Yes. Mais alguma? Lá atrás, gente. Vocês podem só passando, por favor? Obrigado.
Tá saindo? A minha pergunta é sobre a liberdade e sua relação com a arte. Por um lado, ao menos para mim, nós não somos livres de nenhuma forma absoluta e abstrata, tampouco
Vira o microfone assim, ó. Deixa na frente. Assim. E aproxima.
Obrigado. Vou começar de novo. A minha pergunta é sobre a liberdade e sua relação com a arte. Por um lado, ao menos para mim, nós não somos livres de nenhuma forma absoluta, abstrata, tampouco de forma concreta, como anseiam algumas pessoas. Concreta como anseiam algumas pessoas. Anseiam. Como anseiam. E o ideal de liberdade nos levou a erros terríveis, pelo menos em termos políticos. Eu posso... E o ideal de liberdade nos levou a erros terríveis, pelo menos em termos políticos. Por outro lado, atualmente, eu penso que se há uma forma de sermos livres, seria por meio da arte. Eu queria saber se para o senhor a arte seria mesmo o único caminho para a liberdade coletiva e individual. Se podemos ter esperança de haver outro meio.
I think I have a very good answer to this question, but it is not a short answer. So I want to distinguish 4 different understandings of freedom, or maybe 5. A lot turns on what we mean by freedom. The first, most common understanding, I guess, is volition, or the power of choice. That it's up to an individual. The individual can choose to do either A or not A. Volition, choice.
Ele falou que ele acha que eu tenho uma boa resposta, mas que a resposta não é curta. Então ele falou, vamos lá, ele tem 4, talvez 5 tipos de liberdade, né? Então a primeira, que seria a mais comum, seria o poder de escolha, né? Então que o indivíduo acha que pode fazer A ou B, né? Ele teria esse poder, né, de escolher. Ele usa tem alguma tradução? Volition? Volição. Como? Volição.
That's usually what the debate between freedom and determinism is about. The second is liberty, or absence of constraint, what Hume called hypothetical freedom. If I want to do X, then I may. Nothing else stops me. I am uncoerced, or at liberty.
A segunda seria a ideia de liberty, que seria a ausência de qualquer tipo de restrição, né? Então a pessoa diz, se eu quero fazer alguma coisa, então eu posso fazer e eu vou fazer.
I think the common public conception of freedom nowadays is a kind of combination of those two. I get to choose without anybody getting in my way. Let me do anything I want to do at all. So a free market economy is a good thing because it makes it possible for people to be at liberty to buy and sell. I agree that all of this is largely not so good.
Ele falou que a visão mais difundida hoje da ideal de liberdade seria uma mistura dessas duas, né? Que é essa ideia então de então se eu acho que eu posso, eu acho que eu posso, que eu tenho direito de fazer tudo que eu quero, afinal de contas eu sou livre, né? E aí ele dá o exemplo do mercado livre, né? Então ele fala, pois é, essa ideia do mercado livre, que o mercado vai regular a si próprio, e ele vê que essa ideia não é tão interessante, né? Essa ideia de liberdade.
Conception number 3 is Kant, autonomy, being a law to oneself, following a policy that it is reasonable to follow. For Kant, this presupposes volition and liberty. So those are parts of the story and good things, but there's still a correct use of one's volition and a correct exercise of liberty, and that is to become autonomous, self-ruling. This is getting closer to what I'm interested in.
A porque ele está usando o termo que a gente usou lá na primeira, né? You're using the term you used in the first course, right? With the philosophy of literature. No? No, just confusing. Yeah, no. Sorry. Não, que essa ideia de autonomia, né? Para Kant, né? Então, que seria de one to oneself, né? Então, seria uma pessoa consigo própria, né? E que no caso essa terceira ideia, então, ela já partiria de uma pressuposição de que a primeira ideia já estaria posta, né? Mas que há nessa ideia de autonomia uma certa ideia de que há determinadas ações que implicam um certo tipo de correção, no sentido de que há ações que podem ser corretas, né? Podem ser tomadas dentro de uma ideia de correção, é essa a palavra? Correção. Não de disciplina, mas de correto e incorreto.
The problem with Kantian autonomy, though, is that it's too strictly self-directed and not enough concerned with responsiveness to others. Hegel goes further. So Hegel is number 4. Freedom as joint social autonomy, our being mutually with each other, a law to ourselves, or as Hegel puts it, living according to right. The idea here is that we will come to live in reciprocal recognition of the worth of what each other have all done. That's his formula for freedom, or what he calls being with oneself in another.
This is the one I was thinking of. Eu estava perguntando para ele porque a gente falou bastante dessa quarta que é de Hegel, né? Que a gente comentou bastante no curso de filosofia da literatura para ele falar. Não, então a quarta seria essa ideia de que é uma autonomia social que é exercida em conjunto, né? Então, que é dessa ideia de que a gente encontra a si próprio nos outros, né? Encontrar a si em outra pessoa. Então, que essa ideia seria essa ideia de uma espécie de fórmula para a liberdade, né? Que essa de encontrar essa ideia mais compartilhada de autonomia.
But the problem is that we don't know quite how to get that. I'm sympathetic to the structuralist insight that any form of social life will involve some kind of domination or exploitation even. And we don't know how to overcome that fully and live in perfect equality and freedom, or in a Marxist, perfectly communist society. So what do we do then? For me, we cultivate pockets of expressive freedom, I call it, being with oneself in relation to others, where we can find them. Good marriages, good moments of experience of art and conversation about it. Try to make those kinds of relations and experiences more available to people where you can, knowing that it will never be perfect, the work will never be done, and just keep hoping. I think art plays a very important role in that.
Ele fala então que o problema, né, a gente tem essas 4 ideias de liberdade e um problema oposto, né, que a gente realmente não vai conseguir chegar lá, né. Então, daí ele fala, né, dessa ideia construtivista de que sim, né, um reconhecimento de que toda forma social tem algum tipo de dominação, né. E aí ele coloca uma pergunta marxista, né, qual ele é simpático, que ele diz que é o que fazemos agora então, né. Já que a gente não está conseguindo dar conta de mudar essa condição de dominação que parece que está posta nos nossos modelos sociais, né? Então ele volta para essa ideia de do cultivo, né? Cultivo de momentos em que podemos ser nós com os outros, né? Essa última ideia que ele coloca de liberdade, né? Que pode ser, ele dá exemplos, né? De boas conversas, né? Felicidade numa vida conjugal, né? Fazer coisas que te coloquem em contato com outras pessoas, né? E no fim ele fala que é importante saber que a gente tenha consciência de que as coisas nunca atingirão um estado de perfeição, né? Então não vai, a gente reconhecer que a perfeição não é atingível também é uma possibilidade, né, para a gente encontrar esses momentos que ele propõe. E aí ele termina mesmo, né, a última coisa que ele fala é que sim, a arte é central, né? A arte está jogando um papel muito importante nesse jogo. Né?
I can give, I think, 2 images that might be helpful too. I'm an okay tennis player. When I'm playing well on a good day, I am really there in the activity. The strokes are flowing consecutively. My court movement is good. I am at home in my body and in what I'm doing with it. And also with my opponent. We're both trying to beat each other, and one of us will win. But the game is made possible by both of us doing it. There's a kind of communication going on between us as well. So that's one example of a tiny bit of free activity, because it's meaningful and cooperative and embodied in that case. The second image I can give is, you know, El Sistema in Colombia, the system of music education for children that produced Gustavo Dudamel. The more getting children involved in music and the other arts, the more I think they will be seduced into a life of mutual cultivation. So I have some hope for things like that. I would be curious to know whether Olodum is much like El Sistema.
Ele trouxe duas imagens, né, que seriam interessantes para essa ideia desses momentos, né, que ele colocou anteriormente. A primeira, ele falou que ele gosta de jogar tênis, né, e ele disse que ele joga bem, né, e quando ele está se sentindo bem, quando ele está jogando bem, quando ele está jogando, ele se sente em casa com o próprio corpo, né, e ao se sentir em casa com o próprio corpo, com o jogo, ele também tem essa relação com o próprio oponente, né. Porque o jogo ele só é possível quando tu tem outra pessoa para jogar contigo, né? Então, essa ideia de que seria um exemplo muito significativo, porque sem o oponente, né, que também esteja se sentindo bem para que o jogo aconteça, para que o jogo ocorra, também não haveria esse contato. Então, haveria esse contato mútuo, né, recíproco. E o outro exemplo que ele dá seria o sistema educacional de música para crianças, né, que ele fala de ensino de música, ensino de arte para crianças, e aí ele coloca, né, se quanto mais contato com arte, quanto mais contato com música coletivamente as crianças possam ter, mais elas terão envolvimento com arte, mais elas terão envolvimento com o coletivo, né, com essa ideia de troca de momentos com outras pessoas.
Venezuela, not Colombia, I think. So.
Ah, tá, na Venezuela.
That was a long answer. That was the best.
Na Venezuela o sistema.
Gustavo Dudamel. Gustavo Dudamel?
Dudamel é o maestro, né? Gustavo Dudamel, o maestro venezuelano, propõe esse ensino de música. Eu esqueci de falar isso.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I forgot to say that. Yes, now I said it. Dudamel. Tem que fechar por causa do horário?
I guess we should wrap it up because...
Tá. Então tá.
We can add a third perfect image of striving for freedom.
Yeah.
Something togetherness right there. We're going to have wine and a little cocktail. Yeah? Thanks, Richard, for this.
Thank you so much.